Okay, like it says in the textbook Sociology, let's leap into sociology. And what better way to do it than have a chat about how it all works? You'll see Dr. David McGuinness in the week on sex and gender, but we wanted to give you an overview of this unit, Contemporary Society. So Dr. McGuinness has agreed to have a conversation with Professor James Avanatakis, who edited the textbook, so that they could give you a more in-depth understanding of some of the main themes and ideas that we will consider during the semester. So first up, let's look at what society is, what an institution is, and how one can shape relationships in society. Finally, for this first lecture pod, we'll consider meaning and values in society.
Right, James, so contemporary society. Where I'd like to start today is for you to chat to us a little bit about what this thing is that we call society. That's our object of study in this unit. What, to you, as a researching academic in this area, what is society?
So when we think about society, we think about society in a number of ways. I mean, one way is just to look around you and say where you live, and that's a society. You could be living, in the inner city of Sydney, Newtown, or downtown Parramatta, or you could be living on the outskirts of the Blue Mountains, and that's all part of society. So I suppose society is this really simple concept in a way that it's everywhere where we live. It doesn't matter if you live surrounded by millions of people or if you're just surrounded by a few dozen. That's society. But if we begin to unpack it, we actually should understand society as having, I suppose, understand society in two ways. The first way to understand society is the many relationships within that society. So the relationships that we have within our family, with sort of the government institutions that exist, the relationships between, say, men and women, between people from different backgrounds. So that's one element of society we need to understand. The second element of society are the actual institutions themselves. So what are the type of institutions that surround us? We live in a democracy. We're lucky in Australia to live in a democracy. So that shapes the type of society that we live in. If we didn't live in a democracy, our society would look really, really different. So, so there's sort of the society of the everyday, which we can appreciate in what we do, but then there's also sort of the more formal way of understanding society, which is looking at both the relationships and the institutions and the structures. So when we think about institutions, we're thinking about things like government, which is the main institution, but it could be all sorts of institutions. Like schools really help shape society. Like if you think about schools, the moment you go into a school, you're essentially, you learn a whole bunch of norms. You're taught a whole bunch of things that seem normal, like the teacher stands at the front and talks to you, and you just sit back and listen. That creates, I suppose, an understanding of a way of seeing the world, and that's a really important structure. Hospitals are another really important institution that really shape the way that we see the world. And, we go into a hospital and someone sits there and pokes us and tells us what we're doing is good. You're eating healthy, or you shouldn't drink Coke, or you should do this. And so they really shape our understanding of society. Our understanding of what is healthy, what is not healthy. But there's other things like our institutions of the police. The police force is also a really interesting one. And when you talk to, say, especially young people of Aboriginal or African descent, they talk about how their relationship with the police is often really negative. They're often suspected of crimes, and they're assumed guilty until proven innocent in a way. And that creates a sort of, an antagonistic dimension of society. But so there's some of the institutions, but we can also look at sort of like personal institutions, like the institution of marriage. Right, and in Australia, by law, marriage is defined as between a man and a woman, and we can see how that institution is constantly being challenged because arguments around same-sex marriage, and so we can see how these institutions exist and help shape our view of the world, but how they're constantly changing. So the issue of marriage is one, but also you can see how organisations like the New South Wales Police Force have done a lot to try and improve their relationships with sort of certain communities, including the Aboriginal, the Middle Eastern community, and the African community. So institutions can be almost anything. They can be formal institutions, and they can sort of be informal institutions. So as I said, society is made up of sort of institutions and structures, and also the relationships, and they come together, and one will shape the other one. Look, one way to think about this, or one really good example to think about how this happens, is actually from the moment we're born, we're defined as a boy or as a girl, right? And that's really interesting because that's your sex, right? But your sex, which is your sort of biological parts and bits and things like that, well, that's how they define us. But what they also do is often they will help define us in such a way that will classify you into different areas within the hospital. And if you're a girl, you'll often get classified within a sort of the pink section. If you're a boy, you get classified within the blue section. So automatically there's assumptions made based on your biology, what colour you prefer, right? And if you think about that, that happens all the way through our lives. Like when you're a child and you go into a toy store, there's this an assumption that girls like playing with dolls and doing sort of girly things, and boys like hammers and cars and doing boy things. And so you can see how this immediate definition between defining your sex and giving you a title, boy or girl, actually shapes your life immediately. And and when you go to I remember going to a friend, they had a baby, and I went with my partner, and she bought the baby a green outfit, and it was a little girl, and the mother of the baby turned around and said, "Thank you for not buying something pink," and it's interesting how just that one title becomes given to you by one institution, in this case a hospital. It just defines your life, what your expectations are, how you're expected to behave, everything from the way you stand to the way you dance to often, and up until recently, career choices. And so so you can see how there's a relationship between the institution and you can see the link between the institution and the relationships that are created within society. So I'm going to start somewhere and go somewhere else, okay?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fine.
When we study society, there's a whole bunch of people that look at society a bunch of different ways. So, we recently in Australia we had the census, and the census, what it does, it measures everything we do. From how we get to work to the type of work we do, if we have a religion or not, what type of religion it is. Now, you learn a lot about society when you do that, when you do something like a census and you study it. But actually, my argument is that you can actually learn more about society by just going to a family barbecue, right? And if you go to a family barbecue, you walk into a family barbecue, and if it's anything like my family, and it might be a little bit like this or might not be like that, but when you walk into my family, what ends up happening is it's like magic. As my family members walk through the back, as they walk through the back garden, and all these family barbecues happen at my house. The men, they go and stand by the barbecue, right? And the women, they all go into the kitchen to make salads, okay? Now, the men, I don't know what they're doing around the barbecue, but they're all just standing around and they're staring at it, and you can tell who's in charge because that's the person with the tongs, and and the women are inside making salads. Now, you can see how that moment, right, defines a lot about the way that we perceive the different genders. The way that what we expect from men, we stand around and we do this manly thing of cooking meat, and over there the girls are doing these other things. And we can see how within a barbecue you actually get to reflect the values of a society in this little micro example. But those values actually are actually portrayed across the whole of society. Historically, men had jobs like they were doctors and policemen, and the word policeman, and accountants and things like that. They were seen as being male. They required, I suppose, strength and decision making and things like that. And women were seen as being more caring, and so they did more caring things, like they were teachers and nurses. And you can see how those values were reflected across society. So the values in that barbecue, in some way, are reflected across the whole of society. Now, the other thing that we learn from that example is that's dramatically changing, right? And so now it's no longer that your career is simply defined by your gender, right? Because now, we had up until recently, we had a female prime minister. So those values are constantly changing. But we also see how that change can also go backwards. So, under the previous government, we had a female who was a prime minister and a lot of female cabinet within the cabinet. Whereas under Tony Abbott, we only had one woman in all of the government, in the senior parts of the government. So these values are constantly in flux. And so one of the things that we learn about when we look at that is that our decisions, like, we're shaped by those values. So, we carry the expectations within those values, but our decisions also help shape those values. So they're not predetermined or predefined. They're things that are constantly in flux, and the decisions we make and the things that we do with our lives, the relationships we build and with those around us, as well as these institutions, will help shape those values into the future.
So did you enjoy the montage of clips in that conversation between Professor Avanatakis and Dr. McGuinness? They were from a film called Samsara, directed by Ron Frick, which is really all about human societies and the world.